Okay. All right. Well, I can kick things off here. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If not, feel free to throw something in the chat and let us know. But we appreciate you coming out tonight. My name is Caleb Ashling. I'm a natural resources specialist for the city of Burnsville, and part of my job is doing habitat management and buckthorn removal in city parks. And part of it is also working with residents on education for buckthorn issues on private property. So appreciate you coming out to learn more. Just a couple of Zoom housekeeping items. This presentation is going to be in webinar format, which means that your video screen will not be shown. And your microphone will also be muted throughout the event. But we do encourage you to ask questions if you have them. And to do that, you can use the chat feature. The chat button is located on the bottom of your screen on a PC or a Mac. For a mobile device, you can tap the screen to make the control options appear. Click on participants, and at the bottom of the participant list, you can click on chat and enter your question there. If you have questions during the event, if I can answer them, I will. Or if not, if they're more for Bree, we'll hold those questions and have a Q&A session at the end of her presentation. So yeah, back to kind of our main topic tonight, and that's buckthorn. So as most of you know, buckthorn is a very prolific invasive species that can take over just about any wooded area where it's not actively being managed. And it can create a big problem, or is a big challenge to remove. But there's a lot of good reasons to try to get rid of buckthorn, including increasing the usability of your property, being able to move around on your landscape or your wooded area, attracting more wildlife and providing more habitat for wildlife or wildflowers for pollinators, or even increasing your property values by improving the aesthetics of your property. So there's a lot of good reasons to want to remove buckthorn. But because it is a challenge, you want to make sure that you're getting the right information to get started on the right foot before you dive into it. And that's really why we're all here tonight, is to talk about the best way to go about it. And that's why we're bringing in our main presenter, Bree Bowerly, to talk to you. And so I'll just give a quick introduction to Bree before I turn things over to her. Bree has been with Minnesota Native Landscapes for 12 years since graduating from Bemidji State University with a master's degree in wetland ecology. She works in Minnesota Native Landscapes Land Management Division, or she did for 7 years before moving into the outreach coordinator position. Bree has worked closely with landowners to create adaptive management plans to control invasive species and to enhance natural areas on both private and public property. So as you can imagine from Bree's time working with the Land Management Division at M&L, she has had plenty of time out in the field, wielding a chainsaw, going after all sorts of buckthorn, including a project right here in Burnsville, a very long and challenging 28-acre removal out at Alamagnet Park many years ago. So Bree has a wealth of experience with buckthorn, and we're really lucky to have her here tonight to tell us more about it. And with that, I will turn things over to Bree.
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, I don't get out in the field to do work as much as I used to, but I do try to stop by Alamagnet every time I pass by and check on it and make sure you're taking good care of it. So Yep, I'm Bree, and I have had the chance to work with Buckthorn a lot over the years, and I'm hoping I can share some good advice on getting rid of it, and maybe some inspiration on like keeping up the efforts and some photos to help show some of the things that we can put in, in place instead of Buckthorn. So I'm going to start the presentation now, and sorry, the corner of the screen is cut off a little, but I think we'll get all the information that we need here. So like Caleb said, I work for Minnesota Native Landscapes. Now we're known as M&L, and we do a bunch of services, but we also grow our own seed and plants. We do wildland fire, we do grazing, and kind of a little bit of everything that relates to ecological restoration, or kind of restoring the ecosystems that are native to Minnesota. So get lucky that we don't always have to work with just buckthorn, but we also get to plant some really cool plants and take care of some other ecosystems as well. So to start off, it's important to introduce buckthorn and talk about why you might not want it on your property. So these are just some kind of things that I hear over the years about buckthorn in general. And it's okay. It's technically a shrub brought over from Europe a really long time ago as a hedge species, and that's actually something that people still like about it, even though they don't always know like how disruptive it is to native ecosystems. So the screening factor is kind of our most common complaint when buckthorn has been removed from a city parcel or even a neighbor's property. It's kind of funny how often you hear people complaining about things that their neighbor did, especially when it's improving the ecosystem. So it's kind of just a learning curve. Buckthorn doesn't provide great habitat to our native wildlife, whether it be birds or deer or rabbits, and certainly not pollinators either. It can form really dense thickets and doesn't allow regeneration of native understory or native woodland sedges or wildflowers. And so there's a lot better things that we're lucky to have here in Minnesota, hundreds of native understory species that we could be putting in or growing or allowing to grow in place of buckthorn, that will provide habitat and allow our woodland understories to regenerate, with native woody species like, oaks and maples and things like that. When you have really dense buckthorn thickets, those species aren't able to seed themselves and grow new trees. So after your, older growth trees die out, you could be looking at, not having much left over. So that's just some of the drawbacks of having buckthorn, infestation in your woods or on your property or on park or city land. Unfortunately, the thing about invasive species, especially here in Minnesota, is that they often have like really aggressive tendencies, that kind of go season long. So they grow really quickly. They spread easily. They grow early in the spring through late in the fall time, not allowing sunlight to the soil surface in the early spring for spring ephemerals in the woods and things like that. And they keep their leaves on quite late into the fall time. So like I mentioned, they do a really good job of outcompeting native understory species. So we start with some buckthorn identification. So in these photos, and a lot of what I'll talk about is focusing on common buckthorn, but there is also the glossy buckthorn that is becoming a little bit more well-known in Minnesota. But overall, I'll talk most about common buckthorn because that's a lot of times what you're seeing in your backyard or in your woods, especially if you're not along like a creek or a waterway or something. Buckthorn kind of gets its name from this, from the terminal buds. They tend to kind of look like a like a hoof. And then they have a small thorn in between those two terminal buds. Sometimes, not all the time. You're going to see some ends of the sticks that don't have these terminal buds in the stick that, or in the thorn that looks like that. But you can kind of glance around the plant and you should find some that look like this photo on the left. It's a pretty tall understory shrub. Can grow, you know, like 20 feet tall. Like the second picture is a pretty mature multi-stemmed plant. It's kind of spreads loosely. It's pretty branchy. The bark is brown, but there's also silvery or like corky areas within it. It can look a lot like our Native American plum. It can look a lot like cherry. It can look a lot like, you know, a few other of our native species here in Minnesota. So it's really important to kind of get an idea of what it looks like. You can even go around during the active growing season and tie ribbon or flags on, you know, some of the larger buckthorn to plan to cut later in the year. One of the best ways to identify buckthorn, you know, some people like to use the berries. So the female plants get these black berries in, you know, August or September, and they stay on for quite a while, you know, through most of the winter. Not a lot of animals eat them. They're diuretic, so they're not really good for animals, but birds, almost every animal will eat them. And that's why it's, you know, spreads if they're hungry enough, I should say. But like I said, it's really not all that nutritious for them. So the female plants have these clusters of blackberries. And once you get the hang of what those look like, it's also easy to tell apart from native fruit-bearing shrubs like chokeberry or, you know, some of the other cherries and things like that. But the leaves are really the best way, I think, to tell whether you're dealing with a buckthorn or something else. They are sometimes arranged on the stem in like an opposite pattern or an alternate pattern, so that's not super helpful. But the leaf itself, the way the leaf margins look, finely toothed, they're just like very fine teeth along the outside of the leaf. The way the leaf veins branch out from the center vein and kind of in pairs along the mid vein. And then the leaf shape itself is kind of an egg shape. And then, you know, the color of the leaf, eventually you get the hang of what that looks like as well. And I think our video here is blocking the fourth photo or the one on the right side, but the color of the leaves does change a bit, you know, through the growing season. And so that's not a great indicator, but, you know, telling apart buckthorn from other species while they're one color or another can help. But it's really the shape of the leaf and the way the veins look that helps me the most. Again, that thorn on the end of the stems, it can be helpful, but, you know, don't mix it up with other native thorny species either. So it's really kind of a thorn coming out from in between those two terminal buds. We're getting into the time of year when it's actually really great to identify buckthorn on your property, because it's going to soon look like this. And I can't make any promises this year with the drought. The buckthorn is losing its leaves earlier. They're falling off green, but so are our native and other tree species. So, but this typically happens like mid to late October, where we've lost all of our other leaves. And the buckthorn is still very much green, still very much actively growing, like I said in that slide a few back about how they take advantage of the growing season and they grow really late into the fall time. They really do that. So it's a good time to get out there and identify buckthorn on your property and make a plan or even get to work on removing it. This year, I'd expect this sort of look, maybe a couple of weeks early, so maybe even most of October. you could be out there identifying buckthorn. And, you know, it's not the only understory to stay green. You know, there are other invasives like invasive honeysuckle that stays green. And so if you have that, by all means, take that out as well. I'm not going to cover that much here, but use the same methods that we'll discuss. For removal, but there are some natives that stay green, but once you identify that leaf and what that looks like, you'll be able to move through the woods and check out your own buckthorn infestation. So another way to kind of move through your property and check it out, you know, is walk around and identify the different life stages that you have growing in your woods. And this is kind of a good idea, or, you know, to keep an eye on throughout the whole growing season. So earlier in the spring, you're likely to identify small resprouts on the forest floor. These can be resprouts from previous work done. So maybe some sprouts coming up off of a small stump that was trimmed, but not treated. Or maybe these are new plants coming from berries that were in the soil. So the buckthorn berries can stay viable for 2 or more years in the soil, and you know that's hundreds of fruit per tree, and each fruit has 3 or 4 seeds in it, and so you know you're looking at just thousands of seedlings coming up from a single large female tree. This is a photo of an area after a large removal was done without stump treatment. So you can, or, you know, this is also the way it would look if an area was actively grazed with cattle and then the cattle were removed. That's sometimes what we see out there is all these resprouts all in the same life stage, but they're about 6 feet tall. So they have quite a bit of energy coming up from their roots. And able to grow, you know, a 6-foot tall whip all in one growing season, and kind of makes it control difficult going forward. This one is kind of similar to that photo I just showed, but this is a good indicator of buckthorn, you know, in a kind of mid, you know, 4, 5, 6-year-old life stage, where they're, you know, pretty tall, but still pretty reasonable size stem. I think this is one of my favorite sizes to work on removing before you're dealing with much larger multi-stem material like this. Because as you cut this and try to drag it through your property, it's very frustrating to work with, but you know, you can cut it into pieces and get the job done too. So, you know, when you're assessing your property for buckthorn, there are some considerations, you know, between timing, what method you might choose for removal, and what materials you might need. So I'm going to go through all of those considerations here coming up, but it's just important to kind of draft like a really good plan. So even if you're not quite ready to tackle buckthorn as a whole, at least you're going to have some tools in your toolbox here, or you know, some knowledge to create, you know, a really comprehensive plan. Knowing that buckthorn management is a multi-year commitment, I think, is really important, so you don't get discouraged after, you know, 1 or 2 seasons of working to remove it, or after a really hard weekend of cutting or pulling or something like that, and only making, you know, a small dent in your property. Just it's important to just kind of know going into it that it's definitely a multi-year commitment. Creating a plan for your property, whether it be that you remove the berry producing plants first, I think that's usually a really good first step. Of course, berries can be brought in from, you know, bird droppings or elsewhere, but the best thing you can do is to remove that source of thousands of seeds per tree or per shrub by removing those female plants first. And then after that, whether you want to start by removing other large material, or starting small with some pulling and you know, removal of small stems that are near the forest floor, if you can start by doing some hand pulling and in the evenings or whatever is going to work, and then create a plan for follow-up control, knowing that buckthorn, actively resprouts from its own stem, but it also grows pretty prolifically from seed. It's unfortunately not one of those plants that doesn't grow that well from seed. Timing considerations: if you're doing cutting of larger material, plan that work for later in the season. When you're cutting, it's best to do it, not in the springtime when the sap is flowing upwards, but to do it later in the year, especially if you're treating your stumps. But I personally like doing buckthorn work when the weather isn't very hot and when the leaves are off the other trees. It can make moving around through the woods quite a bit nicer. And it's also really great to do when the mosquitoes aren't out, because they also can kind of ruin your day working out in the buckthorn woods. Another consideration, and I mentioned flagging some trees, because I like doing buckthorn work over frozen ground, whether you're cutting large stems and dragging them to a trailer to haul to a site, or to a chipper, or to any way that you're cutting large material. It can really have minimal soil impacts if the ground is frozen. So you're cutting and you're dragging over your lawn, or you're working over sensitive woodland soil, you're going to do a lot less disturbance of cutting and pulling, or even bucking up of those larger shrubs or larger trees if you're working when the ground is frozen. So you flag some of those and get back to it later in the year when maybe you don't have as much going on. That's a good way to do it too. Hand pulling is a great option for the smaller material, about stems smaller than 3/8 of an inch. You can probably go like pinky size stems, can typically be hand pulled. Sometimes larger than that if you have nice soft soil, sometimes after a rain. But pulling a lot larger material can be hard on your back and your hands, and also on the soil, creating quite a bit of soil disturbance. So consider hand pulling for these smaller stems, like in the photo, all the way up to about pinky size. And of course, then you're working with pretty low impact and low input. You can kind of stack them up. You can put them in a fire pit, just in a standard fire pit. It's pretty easy to work with. So hand pulling is a great option. It is a bit laborious. So this one I think is really cool. And the more I learn about it, the more I like it. It does create some soil disturbance, but I also am going to talk a bit about restoration options later. So it's important to keep in mind. But as often as you can, I like to keep soils intact how they are. When you uproot plants, if you're pulling everything out, you're disturbing the soil surface, and you tend to see a lot more regrowth of weeds after you do that. But I think the way that this particular tool, the weed wrench, works, it's has more benefit than harm when it does disturb some soil. So this particular tool it works with like a simple lever action. It clamps onto a stem. I think this is maybe like the medium size weed wrench, which can work on like a 1.5 inch diameter stem. And it works up to, I think there's larger ones, 2 inches or maybe even larger if you were to buy one of the biggest ones. But once you get to that point, then it's quite hard to wrench out, because the buckthorn has a pretty decent root system. But yeah, so this can be a great tool to move through some pretty medium-sized buckthorn, but I think it can make a pretty big impact in just a couple of days. It doesn't cause your back a lot of pain, because you're working off of like leverage off the ground. And if you clamp it on right and you lean off, you kind of push that lever down, and it leans off the soil, and it should come out with pretty minimal soil disturbance if you're doing it right, and not pushing the size of it too much there with what you're pulling. But it's just a pretty handy tool that's pretty eco-conscious as well. And I'll let Caleb hop on here to talk about this nice opportunity for City of Burnsville residents.
Yeah, thanks, Bree. Yeah, so the Buckthorn Weed Wrench, as Bree mentioned, can be a really useful tool, and because of that, the city loans them out to Burnsville residents. So we have, I think we have 7 or 8 of these at our Public Works building, and they're basically free to rent with a $150 deposit. You can keep it for up to 2 weeks, sometimes a little longer if we don't have anyone else beating down our door to grab it. And if you'd like to pick one up, you can schedule a pickup time because our office is currently closed to walk-in traffic. So that's a little bit of a different arrangement than previously, but give us a call. The number's listed here. There's a form that you'll be directed to fill out and then bring in at your scheduled pickup time. And you would be picking it up from our maintenance facility, which is off Frontier Court behind the Valley Food Co-op. Yeah, so a good tool and can be a nice way to get rid of that smaller buckthorn.
Perfect. Okay, so then moving up to the larger material, really my favorite tool, too far, is it's pictured in the top left corner. It's called a brush cutter, but it's really a chainsaw with a saw blade head. You can remove about 4-inch diameter material, or you can cut, you know, a lot of times these multi-stem buckthorn, they come apart in smaller chunks. So it can work on a lot of those, but also you can upgrade to a chainsaw for those. But it's just a really handy way to buzz through a larger parcel of land. And you can rent these from some general rental supplies. You know, you definitely want to make sure you're working with the right tool for the job. So you don't want to outfit a smaller weed whip that doesn't have the capacity for a saw blade head. But these larger weed whips with the dual handle and the sling strap, or well, I guess this is more than a sling, harness strap. That's the one that you're looking for. And yeah, it can be really handy. It can be a little bit dangerous, but you know, if you're go slow and you know, keep in mind that you're working with a spinning saw blade, it's really a good way to make a job go pretty quickly. Now, keep in mind when you're cutting with a saw blade or a chainsaw, you're going to have stumps that you need to make a plan for. And I'll go over those options in a minute here. But if you don't do anything to the buckthorn stump, you're going to end up with a crown of resprouts. So it doesn't just end up like one little stem after you skip, you know, doing anything to the stump, but it sends up a dozen stems or more in a crown around the stump that you've left there. So flush cutting of buckthorn is like the worst for resprouts. It always resprouts in these multi-stems, and so that's important part of your plan that you're creating is to consider that. And then another plan to have in place is what you're going to do with the cut material, because it does add up to be quite a bit of material. You can, you know, buck up smaller stems and burn them in a fire pit, all within the city fire code. So make sure you're checking that out, especially depending on what time of year you're burning. But you know, a lot of the year, and especially in the fall and winter months, if you're burning in a regular 3-foot fire ring, that's probably okay. But again, just you can check on the fire website with the city. But then there's other, you know, methods. You can cut the stems into small pieces and leave them laying, but that's not great if you're planning to do some, you know, restoration. You can create small stacks. But the best thing to do, because buckthorn does produce quite a bit of biomass, is to remove it from your property. So one way to do that is renting a chipper or hire somebody to come and cut and chip it. But there's also some great city programs. So I didn't ask Caleb, do you want to talk about these, or do you want me to talk about them?
I can talk about these.
Okay, awesome.
All right. So yeah, because buckthorn removal is a challenge, the city has developed some programs to, try to assist residents with the effort. We're not going to be coming on your property and cutting down the buckthorn for you, but at least it's something to try to make it a little bit easier. So the first program is the Neighborhood Buckthorn Pickup Program. And this is an opportunity for you to gather some of your neighbors and try to get a bit of a communal effort going on buckthorn removal and some neighborhood education. And so for this program, you'll need at least 3 property owners to participate to be able to apply for the program. There is a process to it. So you'd apply by July 31st, and we have everything set up for this year. So this would be something to consider as you're making your plans for next year. And then we typically can work with the majority of the groups that apply. And so we'll work with the applicants to set up a pickup in September or October. And just a side note for folks who have a larger lot, sometimes not as much of a neighborhood area, but they have a big property, you can apply for the large lot version of this program if you have at least a 1/3 acre of buckthorn. And so this just shows our website where you can find more information on the buckthorn pickup program. And we have an online form that you can easily type in all the information and submit it pretty quickly, or you can also print out your application as well. And so once you've applied and if your group's selected, I'll work with you to select a pickup date for that cut material in September or October. So kind of prime buckthorn cutting season. Your group will get the buckthorn cut. You'll stack it into piles in an accessible location. Sometimes we've had, almost a block or 2 blocks of buckthorn all lined up for us to pick up, like you can see in one of the pictures here, and that's awesome. So you get it stacked up before the official pickup date, and then the city will come with our contractor and get that material picked up for you. So it's basically a way to get disposal of the cut buckthorn material.
That's awesome. It's really handy. And then there's this other option.
Yeah, so, if your neighbors aren't so interested in joining your neighborhood group, another option is to use our city compost site for free buckthorn disposal. This site is not open to the public at all times. It's normally a closed site just for city staff uses for other garden weeds and stuff like that. But we do have it open for buckthorn on some select dates throughout the summer and fall. So the schedule for that is the last Saturday and Sunday in June, July, August, and September. And again, as we move into prime buckthorn cutting season, we open that compost site every Saturday and Sunday in October. So I've got the dates listed here so you can see what's kind of left in the season. And so for this option, you have to have some way to haul it to the site, truck or trailer. And once you get there, there'll be signs that tell you where to unload your buckthorn.
That's awesome, because buckthorn really does make a lot of mess. It adds up so quickly, even if you don't have a trailer, if you just have a truck that you're working with, it's worth it to take several loads here, I'm sure, and get it off of your property. Okay, so that's it for the city programs, but make sure check back if you have questions on any of those dates and take advantage of those programs. Some things that we do in the industry that most people don't have access to, but you might see this work done on city or park land, or you may have a large enough parcel that it might be worthwhile, especially if you have a really heavy buckthorn infestation. This is the largest forestry mower that M&L has, but there's also small skid loader mounted versions that can really work in any size area. But this is a drum that spins with carbide teeth that basically chews up whole trees. It can cut down, very large trees from the top to the bottom, or it can cut it down at the bottom and chew it up on the ground. And what you're left with is kind of a shredded mess on the ground, but that breaks down over time. This is not a immediate, or no, it's not a one and done process either. You tend to see a lot less resprouts from forestry mowing because you're destroying or pulverizing the stumps. You're ripping them open and opening them up for airflow. It can kind of just impede their growth and efficiency, unlike that flush cut stump that I mentioned about with your chainsaw cutting or brush saw cutting. So you do see less resprouts with this method, but over the last few years, the combination of forestry mowing and goat grazing has become super popular and especially worthwhile on some ecologically sensitive areas. But it's a really impactful process to combine those two resources and cover a lot of acreage and improve a lot of acreage fairly quickly compared to the way we used to do it, where you'd have to cut and haul away all the material by hand. So that's what that is. It's really handy to have. Okay, so moving on to the topic of using herbicides and treating the stumps with herbicide. There's a lot to know about this, and I'm going to go through some other methods or alternative methods as well in a bit, but I just like to give some really good background on how to treat stumps and what you could use to do it in a kind of a low impact way. And I get a lot of questions about rates of chemicals to buy in, and I try to give some good advice here, but without seeing what exactly you're working with, I just always reference to check the label of what product you're able to find and use, and that's kind of what you have to base it off of, base your decisions off of, because the label is the law, and it's kind of hard for other people to give advice on that. But as long as you know what you're using and how you're applying it, all that information is on the label. Sometimes it takes a few times of reading it or maybe some Googling to figure out what exactly you're doing, but it can be a really effective process, and we can use some tools. I don't know if this is going to work. If that moved that video boxes for you guys or not, but hopefully it didn't hide it. There's a couple of options for treating stumps with herbicide in a pretty low impact way. Used to be popular to use a sprayer, and there's actually better ways to treat stumps without also treating the forest floor. So using a small paint roller is my number one recommended way of treating stumps, especially when you're working with a larger infestation and combining your efforts with a brush cutter that I mentioned, because you're covering a larger area in a shorter amount of time. Using a tool like a little paint roller can be super helpful for getting all those stumps treated. Using an eco dye to mark the already treated stumps is really important. So usually it's blue. It's most often blue. But this can help make sure that you're not treating stumps that you've already treated. And it also tells you this stump has already been treated, so you don't need to worry about that one. The Buckthorn Blaster is a cool and economical way to treat stumps of any size with a just small amount of chemicals. So if you're working on a small project or you're working fairly slowly, this is a super handy little tool. It's really just very similar to a bingo dauber with a somewhat modified tip. And there's a few different places that you can buy these online, but really if you Google Buckthorn Blaster MN, you'll find some, and they're pretty low cost and very low herbicide usage, which is great. It's really important to remember to treat the stumps immediately after cutting. Otherwise the stumps can dry out and then they aren't going to take in the herbicide as readily. So if you can do it within, 20 minutes or so of cutting, that's ideal. With the larger stumps and using the Buckthorn blaster or the small dauber for applying herbicide, or even if you're using a paint roller, a paintbrush, a foam brush, anything that you're using to apply a small amount of herbicide to the stump, just know that you really need to do the outer ring of the stump, the cork cambium layer. So, on the picture on the right side, the smaller stumps are, kind of rolled all the way over, but on a larger stem or a larger stump, when you're using something like the Buckthorn blaster that's quite small, just a really continuous ring around the stump is going to be effective. You just can't miss any spots. You kind of got to get one full ring around the outer layer of the stump, between the bark and the like the yellow wood. It's kind of a good reference. Buckthorn in the center has that orange heartwood, which I guess is another good indicator that you are cutting buckthorn, is that orange heartwood. Sometimes you can kind of nick the outside of it and make sure you see some orange, and then you're working with buckthorn. A couple of options for working with herbicide that's going to be effective on stump treating buckthorn: glyphosate-based herbicides and triclopyr-based herbicides. So both of these are pretty readily available, and both can be stump treated 50-50 with water, or depending on what formulation of triclopyr you're using, it can be undiluted. But these are the solutions that you're looking for stump effective stump treating, and this is sometimes on the label and sometimes not, depending on what product you buy. But this is the active ingredient percentage that you need for stump treatment. So for glyphosate-based herbicides, 20 to 25% active ingredient will take care of treating your stumps. Glyphosate only really works during the active growing season, so not really during the winter time. It won't soak into the stump like some of the triclopyr-based herbicides will. Those are more oil-based. So glyphosate during those months where buckthorn is still kind of has green leaves on it, and when it's not frozen outside. The triclopyr, that's a different kind of herbicide. You're looking for a wider range of solution there, a 20 to 44% active ingredient solution, somewhere in there. And I talk about these based off their active ingredient name, glyphosate and triclopyr, because you don't need to buy them by their brand name, but you're looking for one of these two active ingredients for stump treatments. They come in a lot of different brand names, but what you need to kind of keep an eye on is what the active ingredient concentration is. So like this bottom one here, which is sold on a Walmart website, it's just called concentrate grass and weed killer. It says 41% glyphosate. So if we go back a slide, for glyphosate stump treatment, we need a 20 to 25% active ingredient solution. So that particular product would be ample to cut 50-50 with water and then treat at a 20.5% active ingredient solution. So you'd be in good shape there. Triclopyr-based herbicides are these two. The most probably popular is the Garland name, Garland 3A or Garland 4. But these are these triclopyr-based herbicides, and a little bit more expensive, but they just work a little bit differently. So those are usually our typical recommendations. Don't buy ready to use Roundup because it is already diluted for treating weeds, not buckthorn, but herbaceous weeds. And it's not going to touch buckthorn stump treatments. You'll still have resprouts, unfortunately. Okay, so what happens next after you have cut your large material or pulled it or rented a weed wrench, and you're left with something else? So you kind of have to consider what is going to be your method for follow-up control outside of the herbicides that we just talked about. That's kind of like the immediate, after you're cutting, you need to use herbicide kind of right away, but then there's also these other options. So I always talk about goat browsing because it always comes up, and it's so fun. We have a few hundred goats. They're great. They do love eating buckthorn and poison ivy and almost anything that's bad in a woodland, or even in other ecosystems, but it doesn't work for every setting, right? So it may not be cost effective in a small backyard, because you can't just bring the goats in one time and let them chew down your buckthorn resprouts and hope that it's gone. It's going to take 2 or 3 times probably, at least, as long as those first visits were well timed. But it works really well on these larger scale projects. It also works really well on sites that are hard to reach with other methods, because goats don't care if they're walking on hillsides or slopes. And like I mentioned too, it's really awesome in combination with forestry mowing. They are also really cute to use. So I know the city of Burnsville has used goats in the park before. Other parks have done it, and it's kind of fun to be able to do that in a backyard scale. It can work. Definitely try it if you're interested. There's some smaller goat fitting outfits in Minnesota. I think the website is hiregoats.com, and you can find different goat vendors and see how small of a property they'll bring them to. There's some that'll bring just a couple of goats out. We tend to bring at least 50 or 100 out at a time, so acre or 2 or more. But anyway, these other methods for stump treatment, or not really treatment, but covering the stump, is the buckthorn baggie and the tin can method. The tin can method is kind of outdated now that buckthorn baggies are a more popular option. What they are is essentially like a really thick black plastic baggie, and you turn it upside down and like zip tie it onto a stump. So there you want to have a stump that's like 4 inches, well, like 3 or 4 inches off the ground, and then you cover it with this thick plastic buckthorn baggie, zip tie it tight on there. And then, the buckthorn baggies, if you buy the actual buckthorn baggies, will come with labels that say, do not remove. And then it like says buckthorn baggie, I think, .com or something. And then if you go on there, then it tells people that you're, treating your buckthorn stumps with the baggies because it starves the stump from sunlight resources. And also, should rob it of like air, so it's not getting a lot of airflow and just kind of suffocating. So it can work on a small scale. You have to tie them on very tight. You can't poke holes in the baggie or else they won't work. So yeah, if they get damaged, if they get moved, they don't work. But if you're able to take the time, put them on very tight, put them on covering the whole stump all the way to the ground level, and cover, some decent ground over a couple of days of doing this, it can be a great chemical-free way to kind of manage buckthorn in the backyard. This isn't done on too large of a scale. It was invented in Minnesota, so that's kind of cool. It's not great on a large scale and not super great on like working on a hillside or something like that, but it can help with resprouts and kind of lowering those numbers, and that can be beneficial when you have kind of a pretty heavy infestation. My least recommended option is continued mowing. It's a lot of work. So if you were to cut your buckthorn and not plan to do much with the resprouts except for just keep mowing it, or with the stumps, if your plan for stumps is to just keep mowing, what I would do is cut the stumps low so that you can use a DR mower or a brush hog or something like that to continue to mow the resprouts when they're small. and woody like in the photo here. You couldn't do this with a lawnmower, or you'd be sharpening your blade every 5 minutes, I think. But the stumps will continue to put out resprouts for a very long time. So at least a couple of years, up to, you know, several years. And then again, like those berries, because they are good at growing from seed, buckthorn will continue to produce new stems. So having a plan for maintenance mowing is important. I just wouldn't suggest it as your only method for removing buckthorn. So you can take care of the stump from the cut material. So after you've pulled or weed wrenched or cut and treated or cut and baggied or cut and kept cutting for a while, you know, what's happening next, or what's your next move when restoring your backyard woodland? So overseeding is an awesome idea. And, you know, if you have a really heavy buckthorn infestation and you're worried about resprouts, you might consider waiting a year to do a seeding. You know, 1 calendar year, or maybe you wait until the fall and you seed the next fall, and you have a really good plan for treating or pulling or cutting resprouts in the spring and summer, and you're going to really be on it and watch for them, and then you're going to clear up the leaves from the understory so that you can get down to bare dirt and seed some new native seeds. That's a great option. One method aside, or one idea that's not necessarily native to Minnesota, is this idea of these low grow fescue. They're kind of like a turf alternative. So they grow taller and shaggier than turf grass. In fact, some people have low grow fescue as part of their lawn blend, but you're mowing it and you maybe would never know. But these kind of create a more formal setting. So if you're trying to reclaim part of your woodland to, you know, use as recreational space, or if you're planning to have a lot of resprouts, you could consider this fescue blend, and then you're able to kind of manage new buckthorn seedlings through this kind of like 6 to 8 inch tall vegetation, which is kind of really manageable to work with, to mow over, that sort of thing. This low grow fescue blend is the main component of bee-lawn seed mixes in Minnesota, but not necessarily native to Minnesota. We have some other options that are, I think, more interesting, but this is just one that I like to mention. Sites recovering from heavy buckthorn infestation, you might consider not putting the dollars into a higher diversity mix right away, but maybe right after your removal, you seed something like a low diversity native grass mix, just to get some good cover established, provide some competition to the buckthorn resprouts that are thinking about growing. So this can provide some pretty good cover of these, you know, 3 to 4 foot native grasses that fill in really well in shaded environments. This can work too if you're going to kind of be mowing, you know, in the next year to control new buckthorn growth. If it's just really if you have a lot of buckthorn stems, a very thick layer of buckthorn, this can be a good investment while you're managing that new growth and those smaller stems that come up, you know, over the next couple of subsequent growing seasons. But what's more exciting is introducing even more diversity with something like a woodland mix that has like a ton of cool flowers, as well as some of those grasses. And maybe the grasses are a little bit shorter and a little heavier on the cool native sedges. You get a cool diversity of native blooms kind of throughout the growing season, especially with the spring bloomers, but you do have some summer blooms and the really important fall blooms. This woodland seed mix would be for something that is like a pretty shaded environment. So 75 to 100% shade, or, you know, pretty dense shade. there's actually some really great natives that will bloom and be really happy in those kind of backyards. Oh, these do promote more diverse habitat than buckthorn would by providing, pollen and nectar resources for overwintering or migrating pollinators, in the spring and in the fall time, which is super important. And you can also mow this seed mix annually for controlling, some of those resprouts, or when I say, resprouts from stumps, but also like those new buckthorn coming up from seed. So, you've got this great diverse vegetation growing throughout the majority of the growing season. In the springtime, you leave it standing over the winter. In the springtime, you come around and you do a weed whip through the whole thing to cut down the dormant stalks, but also to cut down some of those buckthorn resprouts. But it also provides some great competition to those as well. This is a photo of our woodland seed mix. This is a one full year after well, it's 1.5 kind of growing seasons after seeding. This particular site, I don't think was, heavy buckthorn infestation, but either way, you can kind of see how this would provide some really great competition for sunlight and resources where it's actually suppressing the buckthorn growth. And in turn, you get something a lot more attractive to look at. And, the wildlife will really appreciate a lot more. If you open up your woodland and you had a lot of buckthorn, you thought it was super shady, but maybe once you get all the buckthorn out, or I've got some slides at the end that talk a bit about tree trimming. Maybe you're going to tackle a little bit more than just removing the buckthorn, but maybe you all of a sudden have a site that has a couple of hours of sunlight in the afternoon, or 3 or 4 hours of morning sun. You might even be able to go with an even more diverse seed mix. With something like a savanna conversion. So this would be native species that can handle some sun, some shade, and you get even more diversity of wildflowers, which is kind of cool. Some people are pretty surprised at how wide open their woodland gets after removing buckthorn. It can be pretty exciting. So. And then there's also some great native shrubs and trees as well, which are really fun. They're fruit producing for the most part. Some are not, but they have excellent foliage. They provide some nice fall color, which buckthorn do not. And they kind of come in various sizes, so all the way from pretty short understory species like the dwarf bush honeysuckle up to taller species like gray dogwood or the American plum, speckled alder. That one's not too exciting, but these can provide great screening. So if you were one of the people who at the beginning were thinking that you liked your buckthorn because it was good for screening, we have native shrubs that do that service as well, but also provide flowers and fruits and things for local wildlife. And I think they look a lot nicer. They tend to behave a lot better too. So this is a list of a few native shrubs. And then of course there's all the native trees, that you could put in, and you can consider even some coniferous species to provide greenery all through the winter seasons as well, like this pine or spruce trees. One really great option for finding some of these species is the City of Burnsville Native Plant Market. Oh, I don't know if this is an old slide or if the date isn't updated. Caleb, do you know, is this the date with the wrong year, or? We can't hear you. I don't know why I can't hear you. You're not muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is the right date, wrong year. I've been not able to get myself on board with thinking about 2022 yet, but it's the right date. So so yeah, I can just talk briefly about this. Yeah, and Bree knows this event because I know she's been to our native plant market many years. But every year the city hosts a native plant market in May where we bring together multiple vendors that specialize in native plants. So every plant that you see there is going to be a native plant that's going to have some type of benefit to wildlife and the ecosystem. And we set it up as a farmers market style event. So you can come and shop the different selections and different types of plants that are there, and ask our knowledgeable vendors like Bree all sorts of questions on the plants that they have. So it's a really nice opportunity to get some native plants, whether you're buying a lot or just trying out a few new things for your property.
Yeah, and it's a great time too, because tends to be a little bit early side of things for native plants, getting them out of the greenhouse and into the backyard. And so there's a lot of diversity available of species. So that's, one of the opportunities, I'd say, that you can find kind of the most different types of plants or shrubs. So that's really cool. So then there's also another opportunity.
Yeah, so just another workshop opportunity that we wanted to plug while we had folks here was we're going to be offering, I think for now the third year, a workshop talking about how to convert turf areas to a native planting, like a native prairie or a native meadow planting, and how to convert turf areas to pollinator lawns. So it's not necessarily related to Buckthorn, but it's another opportunity to learn more about these environmentally friendly landscaping opportunities. So we'll talk about ordinances and other things that relate to that in the city. And we're still finalizing that date, but it's likely to be late October or early November. So if you're on our email list, you'll get a notification about that. Otherwise, you can keep tabs on the city website or other city outreach channels to see announcements on that.
And do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Yeah, so one thing I had asked Rita to throw in a couple slides at the end here that kind of relate to things that we've been seeing more in Burnsville when we're out meeting with our residents. So maybe more specific to our area. Yeah, there's, in Burnsville, we did have, historically a lot of savanna areas or fairly open woodland areas. So our area used to be fairly open with a lot of sunlight and a lot of, somewhat sun-loving ground cover grasses and wildflowers and things like that. And some over time, we've for various reasons had a lot of weedier tree species that have filled in many of our natural areas and private property areas. And some of those that I would consider in that category are box elder, which is the one that's in the picture here. But sometimes even other native trees like ash and elm can create a very, very dense shade where it can be hard to get a lot of other plants to grow. And when I'm out doing site visits with Burnsville residents, that's something that I see quite a bit, is where they do have buckthorn, but even after the buckthorn's removed, sometimes they have some challenging growing conditions due to some of the dense shade that's on the site. It's not in every situation, and I think focusing on buckthorn is a good place to start. But if you're finding yourself struggling to grow other types of plants in your buckthorn removal areas, trying to open that area up to a little more sunlight, I think, can be something to consider. And I do encourage residents to do their research, obviously, before you start cutting trees left and right on your property. But you are the land manager, the property manager of your site, and if there's a box elder that you don't like so much, there's nothing wrong with cutting down some of those trees, even if they do happen to be native, but you want to have a plan and reasons for doing it. And then another thing that I've been talking more and more to residents about is, if you do have some of that dense shade on your property, and sometimes removing some of those larger trees can be a challenge. Or maybe you just don't want to remove some of those trees that are creating the shade because you like other aspects of having them there. You can increase some of the sunlight. You can get some more sunlight in some of those areas just by limbing up those trees or trimming some of the lower limbs on those trees. And this is a photo here from a project that we actually have actively going on at North River Hills Park, where we're converting some turf areas to more of a savanna planting. And we had some pretty intense shade created under some of these trees where we expected it to be hard to establish some of our native plants. But instead of moving those trees, we limbed them up to get more sunlight underneath. So the two pictures here show the same tree just before and after trimming. So that can be an option to get a little more light if you're struggling with some pretty dense shade on your site.
That's great. You know, typically, like historically, savannas would be grazed by bison, and this grazing height or trimming height looks good for browse height, what they might have done on their way through.
Yeah, so
okay,
think like a bison out there.
Yeah. Feel free. We do have some time for questions, so it looks like there's some in the chat here. Let's see, Caleb, did you get to all of them, or?
I did respond to some of these that were easy for me to respond to, but I have some questions that I know came in by with the registrations. And then I think one really good one to jump in with was someone asked, how do you plant or seed some of those native mixes that you're talking about? So what's kind of some of those installation steps that you'd recommend for people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as much as I'd like to say you can just cut the buckthorn out and sprinkle the seeds out and then you'll get, you know, something like in the photo, it's not always that easy. One thing that's pretty important is to get down to bare soil. So with native seeds, they are pretty easy to grow and they don't require a lot of tending, but you do need good seed to soil contact. So raking out some of that leaf material is really important. Getting rid of you know, the heavy leaf layer, especially if you have an oak woodland, or you know, or several large oaks on your property. You know, getting rid of those built up layer of leaves so that you're down to bare soil. That's going to be how you get your seeds to take, and that's kind of it. You know, with starting from native seeds, you want pretty bare, weed-free soil. By weed-free, you know, like try to get rid of all the buckthorn, and then from there we can manage, you know, the first growing season with a weed whip is a really handy tool to cut down annual weeds that pop up, and maybe a routine mowing every in the late spring after the ground is dried out and pollinators are awake. So, you know, soil temperature is above 50 degrees. So maybe in like May or something, do a little mowing to trim down any woody resprouts or any woody growth, and some of the last year's dormant stalks, and you know, and go from there. But getting those leaves out of there is really important to start.
Great, thanks, Bree. And so if anyone else has any questions, feel free to plug them into the chat. I am gonna ask Bree a few questions that came in with people's registration forms. So I know that was on some of the questions that were on people's mind when they signed up here.
Sure, and you can also, if you have like specific questions about your own project, this email address will go directly to me, so info@mnlcorp.com. If you want to send photos of your like buckthorn woods, or maybe an area that you already started removing buckthorn, that sort of thing, I can try to troubleshoot more specifically that way. But otherwise, I'll just take questions for a few minutes.
Yeah. Great, and I should have mentioned, thank you, Bree, for the presentation tonight. Awesome job as always. And of course, if folks, I think we're nearing our official end time, so if folks need to jump off, that's just fine. But for folks who want to hold on for a few more questions, feel free. So I did have someone that asked, you know, they're interested in leading a neighborhood group for their property, for their townhome property. Do you have any suggestions on, you know, pulling people together, gathering some group enthusiasm to tackle buckthorn?
Well, I've done some volunteer weekends with like the, well, with different groups actually, but usually I think some sort of common, goal to, to pitch it that way. So whether it's, planning ahead for planting flowers or offering barbecue lunch or, or something to just kind of bring everybody together and get everybody excited, pick a date and go from there. Remember, some of those dates try to coincide with the dates mentioned earlier, but also remembering, to do it when buckthorn is green and not a lot of other stuff is in the fall time. Advertising that it's for the birds or, or whatever can be a fun way to kind of pull at people's heartstrings and get them out there.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Food always helps, right? And then
make it a potluck.
Yes, yeah, and hopefully our pickup program can be a nice way for people to reach out to their neighbors too, and let people know, hey, did you know the city has a neighborhood pickup program, and maybe start some conversations that way. So I hear this question quite a bit. Folks will be frustrated on buckthorn removal because they may have removed their buckthorn or they're working on removing their buckthorn, but they've got neighbors around or other property that's still filled with buckthorn. What kind of recommendations do you have to folks who are kind of in that situation where they're frustrated with the buckthorn that's still in the landscape?
Yeah, it can be really difficult. Keeping in mind that, it can also be moved in through, through different means, but, from a mile away, so, unless if there's a berry producing tree that's, directly adjacent to your property, I think, that might be worth asking if it could be removed. Short of that, providing a defense on your own property by planting or seeding or whatever, a diverse understory that will help provide some competition for new buckthorn growth. That can be a good defense on your end, and also maybe inspiring to other people when they see your woodland wildflowers, as opposed to that dense wall of buckthorn that used to be there, but it doesn't really spread rhizominously or anything like that. So, once you remove it from your property, hopefully you're able to put up a pretty good defense. Or after a couple of years of, a native seeding takes a little bit of time to establish, but by then, hopefully, a lot of your seeds are exhausted and your sprouts are done trying to put up energy and things like that. So, just arming yourself with a nice diverse replacement can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's something we've been seeing on our city restoration sites. If you have a lot of bare soil, nothing growing, then it is harder to control that buckthorn long term. But if you get that competition going with some native plants, it gets much easier. So one question came in here. How can we set up a consultation with you on buckthorn projects?
Yeah, just send us an email or visit the website. I think we revamped our website not that long ago, and there's some good opportunities to get in touch on there. But yeah, that's one thing I didn't mention, and it's not just M&L. So you can always price shop around, but there are vendors, out there that will do the work for you. I tend to try to recommend going with one of the ecological based vendors that will do maybe the full scope of project, everywhere from assessment to kind of identifying buckthorn appropriately and removing, and then have a plan for that follow-up, being thorough with seeding and maybe even some maintenance, whatever scope you agree on, but rather than just having it cut and leave it at that. But you can definitely contact M&L or also check around with some of the others out there. We're lucky to have a lot of companies in Minnesota that do this type of work if you don't want to.
And I'd encourage folks, as we mentioned, there's a lot of companies out there, and there are some companies that do more, tree management typically that might do buckthorn as well. But if you're reaching out to companies, I'd encourage you to ask some questions about how they plan on, treating the stumps, and make sure that they're knowledgeable on that side of things. Because I have heard some, frustrating stories from residents that have worked with companies that focus more on tree management that will say things like, well, you can't kill the buckthorn anyway, so don't bother treating the stumps, and then they end up, with a lot of resprouts and are having a hard time afterwards. So hopefully you've got a lot of good information from this workshop tonight that you can use to ask some, questions of the companies that you consider hiring on their plan.
Yeah, that's kind of scary. If done correctly, you should be able to kill buckthorn with the stump treatment. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, maybe just one more question here. Curious, if you have any, it's a two-part question. Any favorite shrubs for recreating screening on properties? And then if you have any other favorite wildflowers or grasses that provide really good competition in buckthorn areas.
I'd say the most buckthorn replacing shrub is the American plum. I've cut a very large one myself back in the day, thinking it was buckthorn, and it was definitely planted intentionally. It can mimic buckthorn a lot, but it looks, I think, a lot nicer actually. That's a really cool tree, and it really does produce like small native plums that you can eat, and it's just a good one for screening. It is an upright, shrub, branching shrub. So it doesn't it's not like a hedgerow. If you have enough sun left over, or enough sun opened up, you could consider the high bush cranberry. That's pretty good at creating like an actual hedgerow look if planted correctly. Otherwise, the grasses, woodland brome is awesome if you can find it. It stays pretty short, but bottlebrush grass is really cool and gets a little bit taller. But really, I like a good variety. Just one or two things, it's harder to compete. So starting with like a good diverse mix of things can really help, because some stuff's gonna work better in one spot and some stuff's gonna work better in another spot, in your yard, based off of little patches of sunlight that you don't realize, alter throughout the day, but also, throughout the growing season, you have that more, more cover of actively growing species, through the spring, summer, and fall time. So I maybe pick like a dozen of my favorites because I want at least 3 blooming each time of the year or whatever.
I think it's a challenging question to ask a ecological restoration person what their favorite plant is, because they can never choose. But plum, I like plum as well. They super early blooming flowers, so great for pollinators, and we've made plum jelly out of the wild plum too, so it is definitely edible and good to eat. So I think those are all great options for folks. Well, I think we've covered the questions that people have, and lastly, I'll just mention too that I'm also here to help, both tonight and then ongoing as well. So I usually try to put my contact information up here, but I forgot to send Bree that slide this time. But it's not hard to find my contact information on the city website, especially on our Buckthorn page. So we do have a pretty expansive page on Buckthorn on the city website, and my contact information is also on there. So feel free, if you have other Buckthorn questions or potentially interested in having me stop out, I'm happy to do that as well. But yeah,
that's an awesome opportunity for people to take advantage of. So hopefully they track you down.
And yeah, with that, definitely want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and learning more about Buckthorn, and hopefully hopefully from Bree's great presentation, I'll leave it inspired to get out there and get a little more buckthorn out of the Burnsville landscape. Any parting thoughts, Bree, that you want to add?
Just to not get discouraged, because we've seen some really cool transformations over the years, and you can be really happy with what your woods look like, even if you have a really dense buckthorn understory right now. And then also to not leave it, not forget it, you know, don't leave it alone for 20 years after you do all of this work. If you just plug away at it a little bit at a time after you get it kind of back in shape, it's going to be kind of a good labor of love over time, and not a big project again in 6 years. So just don't get discouraged, and have fun with it.
Yeah, it's something that I think people get once you get started, you get you can get a little bit obsessed with getting that buckthorn out of there, and that's all right. And I've definitely talked to a lot of residents who, you know, went through some struggles in the early years of getting the buckthorn out of there, but I've just been really pleased with, you know, all the wildlife they see once they start getting those native plants in. So that's great advice, just to stick with it, and I think you'll enjoy the results if you do. All right. Well, thank you, Bree, so much for the presentation. And with that, I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, everyone.